Welcome, everyone. This is Debbie Mayberry with National Kitchen and Bath Association. If you're joining us, you're here for our fourth webinar of the month on lighting. Today's session is called Lighting by the Numbers, Breaking Down the Complexities of Lighting Calculations with Karen Judd-Riley, CKD, NCIDQ. And as you can see, she has other credentials. But Karen, if you're available and ready to go, we're ready for you to start. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Debbie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Karen Judd-Riley, as Debbie mentioned, and I'm fairly active with the NKBA. I'm our local chapter, Eastern Carolina chapter president, and I had the pleasure of working with several other lighting specialists on our lighting badge certification. So it was very, very enjoyable experience. Excuse me. So I want to kind of ease your fears right away. My students told me this title was terrifying when I talked to them about possibly watching this presentation. But I want you to understand, I'm not going to ask you to do complex formulas or calculations. What I am going to do, though, is explain them and break them down so hopefully they make more sense to you why they exist. We're going to look at a lot of calculations already completed by your lighting manufacturer. So a lot of the work is done for you. And hopefully that will help you down the road with your lighting plans. So hopefully you have taken advantage of the other webinars this month. Doug Walter provided a great overview on lighting and considerations on how wellness plays into our lighting choices. Kelly English just on Tuesday talked about the best practices for placement and residential applications. And they have all great information on the general overviews of lighting all month long on every topic. I'm not going to repeat a lot of information. I'm not going to go over a lot of the basics. This talk is going to be about the details and specifics of selection and specifying effective lighting solutions for your clients in residential spaces. We're going to try to break down some of those complexities and sometimes confusing information that manufacturers provide you that is referred to as photometric data. So the first thing we're going to do is a really quick lightning fast review, or a lighting fast review in this case. I'm going to assume that those of you who are listening do have some knowledge, basic knowledge on lighting. If this is a new subject for you, don't panic, but repeated exposure will help you to grasp some of these concepts. So I'm only spending a few slides on this, but the first thing I wanted to go over was make sure we have a common vocabulary of terms. Lamps come in many forms and functions. And it is from these products when we find information about the effectiveness and the quality of the lighting we specify. The wrong lamp in a fixture can disrupt your design decisions by literally casting them in a bad light. Lamps are also the only place where you'll find photometric data. And this series of tests and graphs that each manufacturer provides informs you about the function of the lamp. We often call lamps bulbs, but in the lighting world, they're actually referred to as lamps. And we'll talk more about photometric data as we go. Only if a fixture includes integrated lamps will this information be tested. If a luminaire or fixture does not include a lamp, the manufacturer can't provide you details on its performance because it doesn't know what kind of lamp you'll be using. So those are very different terms in our world. The next one are the two different general types of lamps, omnidirectional versus directional. And this is not new information, but there's a need to distinguish in this presentation. Directional lamps and fixtures are designed to throw most of their light in a particular direction. As you can guess, the PAR lamp on the left is the best choice for recessed can. PAR stands for Parabolic Aluminized Reflector, and it's designed to provide a very directional beam. It's highly engineered for that. The A lamp on the right, which A represents arbitrary, by the way, is a common light bulb, and it is omnidirectional. I found this lamp and used in some of my friends' homes in recessed cans, and they immediately complain about the quality of their lighting. We know it's an inexpensive option, but it's not the correct option. But let's not assume all directional lamps are appropriate for recessed cans. A BR lamp, which stands for bulge reflector, is commonly referred to as a floodlight. Unlike a PAR lamp, a BR is not carefully engineered to direct light in a certain way and often provides a very large beam angle of 45 degrees or more. and I'll talk about beam labels in a future slide. We will see these often used in recessed cans, but they're really not the best solution for that application, but they are less expensive. That's why the power lamps are so expensive, because they are engineered to provide as much light as possible as far into the space. And they can come in a wide range of beam angles down to a really, really narrow spot. And we'll discuss later why that's important. These terms are probably also familiar to you. Lumen provides a way to compare lamps to one another. Nowadays, consumers use lumens as we once used wattage. You pick the biggest and brightest lumen bulb on the shelf based on the lumen output. That's a good theory if you're comparing items. An A-shaped lamp compared to another A-shaped lamp, for example. But if you're trying to, we have to make sure we're not using them together. An omnidirectional, directional light could also be 800 lumens. Each of these illustrations could be 800 lumens. But the lumens measurement is taken at the source of the light. Unfortunately, this gives us no indication on how much light is delivered where we need it to go. Each of these would be vastly different in their results. The resulting light would be much different than the two they were used in the same application. In our world, and especially for calculating lighting needs, we must use different values. And those values are foot candles and lux. Both of these units measure light at a given distance from a source. If you're in the US, you might think you'll never need to worry about lux, but you're wrong, because a lot of manufacturers will give you lux numbers, and you'll have to understand the difference. It's a real simple conversion. For every 1 foot candle, there's approximately 10 lux, and they are exactly the same. This is a measurement at a given distance from the light source. It's based on beam angle and direction, and how much light lands on our surfaces. If you want to use a more precise number, 10.76 is actually the correct equivalent for foot candles to lux, and you can do what I do and use Google Convert, because I don't do those formulas myself either. Before we begin our calculations, let's talk about the goals of lighting in a space. There are very different requirements in some areas of a home than others. Additionally, how do you determine what makes a quality light source? Most of you know that daylight is the ultimate light source and produces the highest quality of light, but we can't rely on daylight strategies alone. Many of you have heard of the IES. IES stands for the Illuminating Engineering Society. They provide detailed reports and information to those in the lighting industry from every type of installation, from parking lots to commercial applications to residential. They have tested and measured and provided recommendations for different applications, and I've listed some of the recommendations here for our residential applications. I will focus on kitchens throughout this webinar for my examples. The range listed here is pretty large, and that's because kitchens can have many functions, from eating to prep work to reading recipes, sometimes homework. My personal target with levels in a kitchen is 75 foot candles or 750 lux on the countertop for prep zones and for work areas. I include an island as a part of the work zone, so often that means I specify extra lighting over that space, usually in the form of a recessed can with a narrow beam over any decorative pendants that I choose. These numbers are also only based for clients under the age of 40 with no vision issues. If your clients are older and they need to or want to stay in their home for a long period of time, you'll need more light. And this is really critical in areas that have frequent accidents like stairs and bathrooms. So next, let's go into the quality of light. Quality of light is now calculated in a slightly different way than it has in the past. I'm sure you've heard of CRI, the Color Rendition Index, as a measurement of how accurately a light source represents color. But it's actually a little outdated. So what is TM30? This chart comes from energy.gov, and you can Google and find this TM fact sheet. It's actually a very helpful reference. You can find that this is a chart showing you the CRI levels and years of issuance and details compared to the TM30. So CRI has been around since 1965. So it's been around for a really long time. The test for CRI looked at how a particular light source generated colors on 8 different muted color samples. This testing generally is referred to as color fidelity, and that's all CRI was tested for, how accurately the color was rendered. They realized later on, about 1995, that those 8 colors were not giving us enough information, so they added some more. They have a total of 14 now, but R9 being the most popular because that's a very saturated red. So here are the colors that are used for each one of those examples. CRI has the 14 colors on the top, and down at the bottom is the equivalent of CRI under the TM30 guidelines. It's referred to as color fidelity and an RF signature when you look at photometric data. For comparison, the top images, we see that R9 value in red, and those are 14 colors. The TM30 testing actually uses 99 colors. Only a portion of them are shown here, and provides a much more detailed analysis. The results are usually very similar. They range from 1 to 100, so the numbers don't change. So industry professionals will often use RF numbers in the same way we now use CRI, and they're considered equivalent to each other. But here's where TM30 really outshines the CRI, because TM30 provides so much more information, including a value or a gamut rating that tells us how saturated a light source is on one color. These images visually describe the light source and are provided as a part of the testing. The black circle on these charts represents an even distribution and illumination of the color white, so it's a pretty pure white. As you can see from the info above each of these graphics, they're very different light sources with similar results. They each show a fidelity of 75, or a CRI of 75, if you will. And they also show a gamut, the RG, of 100. It tells us that there are some shifts in saturation for this product. You can see the one on the left, based on an increase on the outside of the circle, of the black circle, the light source is actually more saturated in the green color spectrum, whereas the one on the right is more saturated in the reds. We can use this information to our advantage if we want to saturate color in a design. Say we have a really beautiful plant we're installing into a space and we want to make sure the greens really pop. We can choose a product, choose a light source or a lamp that really highlights that saturation. So let's put this knowledge into practice. This is a brochure from a lamp company. I'm not trying to promote one lamp company over another, but this is a very well-known high-quality light company. They provide really quality luminaires, or excuse me, lamps. You can see from the basic information here, if we go down to the color metrics of the chart, we find both the CRI and the TM30. And based on this information, we can see that it's a pretty quality light fixture. This is another section of the same product. Hopefully everyone understands color temperature and how that's related in kelvins. It's measured in kelvins. The lower the number, the more warm white we have. The higher the number, the more blue white light we have. And of course, daylight comes in many different kelvins depending on the time of day. That's why circadian rhythm is getting so much press in the news. Hopefully you caught Doug Walters' talk and now have a deeper understanding on the subject. These charts are created as a part of the TM30 testing for this lamp. So these are added into the TM30. On the left, you'll find the spectral power distribution graphic for the sun at noon for comparison. On the right is the color vector graphic we talked about earlier, showing us that the bottom lamp is actually a very even distribution. Will provide a good lighting in the full spectrum of colors. So now on to our next area. If you have any questions at this point, please place them in the Q&A section so we can address them at the end of the webinar. I will take questions as long as I can. The next part of this webinar will discuss factors to consider when specifying lighting solutions. Beam angles have been mentioned a few times so far, but I want to break them down just a little bit more. The beam angle of a light is measured in angular degrees, but lighting doesn't stop there. It continues to dissipate out from that angle or that degree. All directional lighting is strongest at nadir, which is 0 degrees from the angle, just directly down, and straight down from the source. Lighting manufacturers provide beam angle charts to tell us when the lighting reaches 50% of the original light intensity. So we only get 100% right at the center of this beam spread, and it dissipates as we go outward. And that 50% measurement is considered the angle. It's important to understand because if you're trying to get most of the light to hit a work surface, for example, that center or nadir should be landing on the center of your work plane, right where you want to do your work. Light diffuses out from that point. Most photometric readings use measurements at nadir, so we have to be aware of that when we look at those charts. This is an illustration, thanks to Doug Walter for allowing me to use this. This is from his article on recessed can lighting. I actually use a lot myself. This illustration shows us how well it impacts, placement of the recessed can lights impact how much light we get on our work surfaces. When you put the light installed in a work aisle, you get very little foot candles actually hitting the surface. This particular fixture in these 3 installations has a 40-degree beam angle. So in order to get it to hit the countertop at that nadir measurement at 0 degrees, we have to move it closer to the cabinet. Doug recommends 18 to 24 inches from the wall, and that's exactly why. I think it's a good recommendation for us. The center line needs to land in the front edge of the work surface and avoid hitting the user and becoming ineffective like the first illustration. So my argument back to Doug has always been that no one wants to have scalloped effect on their cabinets, right? It's just not attractive. But that's not necessarily true. Lots of designers work with this shadow play of light that really makes a dramatic space. And if done correctly and intentionally, it can provide a beautiful effect. We have a lot more control of our clients' opinions than we think we do. So we need to make sure they understand what they're getting. And this is really no exception. If the lighting is well planned and discussed with your client, scalloping should not be a big issue. Placing under-cabinet lighting at the front edge of the cabinet also provides additional illumination and provides a much safer work surface. If the scallop patterns in your client's project cannot be designed in a pleasing arrangement, you can also elect to use a lamp that has a tighter beam angle. I use 15-degree spots over islands myself because I know the decorative fixtures often specified to hang over those wonderful islands will not provide adequate lighting. These lamps direct much of our intensity into a path to the countertops. Having these options, often provided by the manufacturers, the same manufacturers we use, makes it easy to specify what's needed for this space. So one manufacturer may have all 3 beam angles available for you to use. All right, so let's move on to photometric data. This is where we get more of the information. And while this chart might look overwhelming, it's just a matter of understanding what data is important for your project. So the basics of photometric data is they should provide some real general information. Beam angles, spread of light, the lumens, which is referred to, and foot candles referred to as the luminance, lux and foot candle levels, your color temperatures, and the color quality data that we saw before. You could also get more information to create different calculations and additional calculations. And oftentimes these manufacturers have 3D visual tools that will help you to demonstrate those different lighting levels and show you a diagram of them in place. So I've attached a random photometric data sheet here. I'm not trying to promote one manufacturer over another, but I'm going to quote myself here and say that if you can't get photometric data from your manufacturer, you need to pick another manufacturer. The fact is, all lighting producing equipment has to go through certain testing to be able to claim output. So usually the great deal of information is located on the photometric data sheets, and not all of it is something that might be useful to your particular application. We will break down this information on this particular sheet in just a few slides. But let me kind of retract what I just said and say it's not to say that all lighting you specify has to have tons of photometric data, but understand that you will need it in areas of importance like those work surfaces in the kitchen. I personally have this fixture in my kitchen, and I can verify that the light output is minimal at best. That's not, however, why I chose it. I chose it for its aesthetic qualities and what it adds to the space. This is the information provided by the manufacturer. You can see that there is information about the bulb or lamp, and included in this fixture, it has a CRI of 90. It has a color temp of 2700 Kelvin, so we know it's a little bit on the warm side, or not a little, it's definitely on the warm side. And it has a lumen output of 840. That's the lamp, however, not the lamp installed into the fixture, which is a little tricky. Because they list the bulb information or lamp information separately, they're not testing it inside the actual fixture. Inside the fixture, we have a frosted globe to get through, and that metal banding that further reduces the light output for this omnidirectional lamp. Be aware of those slight wording variations, and don't be afraid to ask your vendor for more details. So back to that photometric data. We're going to start with some simple charts from familiar companies. These two different manufacturers of under-cabinet lighting and in-cabinet lighting, you might have walked through their booths at KBIS in the past. Both are linear lighting, appropriate for under-cabinet installations or in-cabinet applications. While there's lots of information on these pages, the most important information, in my opinion, is the illuminance chart showing the beam angle of the fixtures. If we zoom in on these two areas, we can find very similar information and calculations that have been completed on our behalf. The chart on the left tells us that the foot candle measurement and given distances from the light. It also provides us with beam width at those heights. Unfortunately, it doesn't give me the exact foot candle level from a cabinet to a countertop, which is about 18 inches as we know. It does tell me, however, that this fixture delivers 206 foot candles at 3 feet. So I am confident that I will get a better result with a closer range. Depending on other factors we'll discuss later, this might be too bright of product for my application. Keep in mind that we have that goal of the kitchen work surface is at 75 foot candles or 750 lux. The chart on the right provides me with the approximate height to the countertop, about 500 millimeters, is about 19 inches. And we see a lux value of 425 using the 2700 Kelvin light source. Notice the 5000 Kelvin light source has a bit more lux. Hold that observation for just a minute. This particular lux value is a little bit shy of my goal of 750, but it might be a good solution for in-cabinet lighting or another application depending on my needs. Since these are both linear lighting or strip lighting options, if you prefer, I also need to understand at what length the light is used for the test. The product on the right provides me this information. It tells me that this is tested using a 39-inch strip. I would need to contact the manufacturer on the left to verify. So there is a principle of physics at play when we talk about light intensity and output, and it's referred to as inverse square law. While we won't work out a formula for this right now, it's important to understand the concept of how lighting dissipates as it moves away from the source. In our previous example, it might be logical to think that if we had a foot candle value of the light at 3 feet, we could just double it to get the level at half that distance, 18 inches. That's actually not how lighting works. In reality, when we move away from a light source at double the distance, we don't lose half the light output. We actually lose 3/4 of it. That's right. If we get we get 1/4 of the light at double the distance from a measured output, as illustrated in this diagram. If we triple that distance, we get 1/9 of the light output. Light output drops dramatically from the light source. We would need to do a quick calculation to get the correct value from the previous example, or contact the manufacturer to get more details. Okay, let's go back to that chart from the previous slide. Take a minute to look it over. At first glance, this might be a little overwhelming. That's likely because you don't have the product brochure in front of you to see what we're looking at. There are actually 3 products on this page. I've included the graphics from the brochure here. This particular luminaire is available in many models and configurations. While all of these are 5-inch recessed can downlights, you will notice the top item is a wall washer luminaire. If we go counterclockwise, we find the typical downlight with a reflector trim. And finally, around to the right, we find a directional eyeball luminaire. These are all LED fixtures, by the way, which is why we have a luminaire that's got photometric data. Let's take a closer look at the reflector. The 5-inch reflector downlight has fairly narrow beam. How do I know the beam is narrow? Because the candela or candle power distribution chart provides us with the beam detail of the light. As a note, candle power and candela are often used as synonyms in modern lighting design. If you visualize the chart mirrored to the left, you can see the similarities in beam angle spread from our previous illustrations. We can tell from the chart that this light has a very narrow beam angle, about 15 degrees, based on the information from the chart. Additionally, if you look to the right of that chart, you will find a chart labeled cone of light. This is similar to the luminance charts we use from the cabinet lighting manufacturers. In this case, if we assume a ceiling height of 9 feet, we can see that the countertops will have approximately 193 foot candles, and the diameter of the beam spread is 2.2 feet, assuming that that's about a 5.5 foot distance. This fixture might be used over an island or a kitchen sink, or possibly in combination with a decorative luminaire. Remember when I mentioned at the previous slide that there are different color temperatures have different luminance levels? That is why the top of this information chart, or this photometric data sheet, includes a multiplier table. If you use a product with a color temperature other than 3000, you would need to use the multiplier at the top of that sheet to get the correct results for your installation. So let's try one more. This is a 4-inch LED fixture with various options for aperture or trim. Again, we find the candle power distribution chart, and it gives us information on the beam angle of the fixture. Both these fixtures do a good job to push the light far into the space. If that was not the case, we would see a ball of light, and that circle would be right at the top of the chart with very little distribution below. I don't know many designers who actually use the candelas, so I typically ignore that chart and move to the final chart to the right, which provides the foot candle values at nadir, dead center of the light angle. The first fixture, the 15-degree beam spread, provides us 183 foot candles at a 5.5 foot distance from the source. The 40-degree fixture, the second one, provides us about 80. That's the difference between a well-engineered spot versus a flood. So the beam angles are terribly important. So I know what you're thinking. We skipped over some of that photometric data, and I want to know what it's for, right? Aren't you dying? Well, some of this information, I don't use all of it myself, but I do use some of this for calculations. We've discussed the candela distribution charts and the illuminance charts. We didn't discuss this large chart labeled coefficient of utilization. Before I break this down, there is one very important piece of information I need to share with you. It is almost impossible for us to achieve the luminance levels provided on these charts by our manufacturers. I know, go ahead, get angry. You can't blame the manufacturer. In truth, we, the designers, are really to blame because we provide our clients with so many options and there's so many design choices out there, they can't guarantee the conditions on which we place their lamps or their luminaires. Nothing in their testing accounts for the environment in which we place these fixtures or any variations in power, installation, or maintenance. And those are very important factors to consider.
Karen, excuse me, it's Deb.
Hey, Deb.
Okay, just a couple of things. So a couple of people in the chat are asking me if you could maybe use your pointer to point to certain areas on the chart when you're referencing them, please.
Can you see my pointer?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. I'll do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. All right, so this is the calculation for the Lumen method. We are not going to do this particular calculation, but I wanted to show it to you in case you wanted to try it later. But this is important to understand what is the coefficient of illumination, or I'm sorry, coefficient of utilization. The coefficient of utilization considers three main things: the volume of the space in which you create the design, the efficiency of the lumens on the product itself, and the reflectance values of the space. And that's what we need in order to use this chart. So do you know the reflectance values of your space? Do you know what a reflectance value is? So let's look at this chart in a really easy way. Light reflectance value is something I bring up in almost every one of my lectures because it has a great deal of influence over our lighting selection and it's rarely recognized. In your office, you have an instant lighting design tool that most haven't realized is there. It's in the form of our paint fan decks. These decks provide us with instant reflectance values on a huge array of colors. The LRV, light reflectance values, range from 0 to 100, with 0 reflecting back no light, and 100 reflecting back all of the light. They're often listed as percentages, so you might see a percentage there as well. We can see based on the selection on this image that if we use white, you still don't get 100% back reflectance. Oops, excuse me. That's because you really can't get 100% of all your light back. Some light will be absorbed into the surface. The best we can hope for a white surface is about 80 LRV, and that's an excellent value to get for white. In comparison, a walnut floor typically comes about 20, so we're only getting 20% of the light that hits it reflecting back into the room. So let's go back to the slide. We use the coefficient of utilization to understand our output for reflectance choices in our interiors. Let's use an example of a kitchen with medium-toned cabinetry on half the walls and a medium-toned paint finish on the remainder. We'll use a white ceiling and a dark tile and a wood grain pattern on the floor. Using the LRV values from our paint decks, we're going to assume the wall is going to be about a 50% reflectance, the floor is at 20%, and the ceiling at 80%. So if we go over to the chart, we find the RCC, which is the ceiling reflectance, and find the column for 80. Right here, if you see my pointer. We find the RW, or the wall reflectance, and look for 50. And then we actually have the floor capacity, the floor cavity reflectance is automatically assumed at 20%, so we don't have to worry about that one. But then, we missed the calculation. What is this RCR? So RCR is the room cavity ratio, and yes, it is another formula, but it's one that typically only varies slightly when calculated. I find that most of the spaces I design fall to calculate at 3. So I'm saving you a little bit of time and provide you with that information. If you want to get more detailed and understand that, you can actually look up the formula. It's not very complicated. Now, if we go back to our chart using 3, we see going, my pointer. We have the 80% for our ceiling. We had the 50% for our floor. An RCR of 3 gives us a 0.80, or 80% of what's in that chart on illumination will actually be able to be produced in our spaces. Simple, right? Well, unfortunately, that's not the only thing we have to take into consideration. That is what we use this chart for, and that's why it's located in the photometric data. But we still have one more factor to consider. Light loss factor is the last consideration for this formula, but it's an important one. LLF for short considers the loss of light output from the ambient temperature of the space. For example, heat is an enemy of most lighting, but most especially LED, if you aren't aware. The lamp lumen depreciation, which means any loss of light output that occurs to the light source over time. Voltage variation, which can cause minor damage to the fixtures over time. And the maintenance of the environment, basically how well it is cleaned and maintained. Yes, dust and splatters will decrease the amount of light output over time. Luckily, this calculation is performed for many scenarios, and you can typically get the answers without doing calculations with some basic research. The factor I use, especially with dealing with LED products, is 0.90 or 90% of the illuminance chart. You might hear someone say 85%, but you can use your experience to figure out which one works best for you. So let's put all that we've used into a product we've already reviewed. Using the product provided from the coefficient of utilization chart, remember we had this product at 3 feet at 206.6 foot candles. If we deduct the CU, the coefficient of utilization depreciation, and the LLF depreciation, we end up with an actualized foot candle of 148. So it significantly decreases what we might actually find when we install this product in our client spaces. If we weren't provided with the CU and LLF, there are actually detailed formulas that allow you to work those out yourself. And you can calculate the actual foot candle expectancy in this space. Are you with me still? If this has gotten to the point where you're not really comfortable with this information, that's okay. There are lots of vendors and vendor reps who are out there to help you understand these details. Many of them provide their own training and their own classes on this. I mentioned this in our discussion, so I wanted to talk to you about it really quickly. This is actually a visual interior tool that's provided by many manufacturers. Acuity is one of the brands, and actually this one particularly allows you to place your information for your particular design into a 3D visual tool, and you can see how those luminaires are placed and how they're spread and how much luminance you get in the space based on that information. It allows you to do some manipulation of locations so you can see how it actually works in a 3D visual tool. Okay. Wow, I ran through that really quickly. So let's take some questions. Thank you guys for your time and attention. I practiced this earlier and it took me an hour, so I must have talked really fast this last time. So that is the breakdown in a nutshell of lighting calculations and those photometric data charts that we see. Before I take questions, though, I do want to mention the specialty badge. I'm very happy to say that I had a hand in creating this badge program with some great, talented other individuals in our industry. And it's very comprehensive. I'm quite proud of the work that we created together. But I want to go ahead and open up the floor for questions.
Okay, Karen, thanks so much. That was great. And yeah, I think my mind was blown for sure. But let me just go through a couple of these things. So some questions that have been coming in. What is the difference, if you could go over this again, between RF and RG?
Good question. So RF is really the same thing as CRI in our world. So we see that 1 to 100 ratio, or that score, 100 being the best, and basically reflects off of incandescent lighting and natural lighting. And it gives the most broad overview of the quality of light. It reflects the most colors. RG actually is the color saturation level. So when you have a color that's more saturated than the others, you get the RG notification. And I really encourage everyone to go to the energy.gov site and look at that TM30 fact sheet. It's very precise and concise, and it gives you a lot of great information on the difference between the two.
Okay. Can you talk just a little bit more about the spread of light? Early on, you were talking about that with the can placements.
With the spread of light, that is something that I've talked about in other classes, but I did not cover in this particular lecture because I just didn't think I would have time. So the advantage of having some of these charts that provide us with beam angle spreads, let me see if I can go back to one of them, so forgive me, close your eyes so you don't get dizzy. This one is a really good example on the left because it tells us that when we get a 3 foot away from the fixture, for example, we actually know what the beam width will be. So that will help you plan your placement. Again, the beam width is when the light gets at 50% of the original nadir illumination. So you can overlap these beam angles. There's no reason why they have to be tip to tip. Overlapping can actually give you a better quality light source and more intensity in output.
Okay. Let's see here. So when you're talking about shadow play on cabinets, is it naturally created in installing cans at a certain distance from the wall? You mentioned 24 inches.
Yeah, so when you install a can 18 to 24 inches, whether or not there is a scalloping effect on the cabinet depends on how big the beam angle is. So if you use a really narrow spot, you might get some light onto the front surface, but you might not get a lot of intensity in that shadow. So it really just depends on what you choose in terms of your beam angle. If you want more of the light to hit the countertop, you use a tighter spot. If you don't mind a lot of light hitting the cabinets, or you want that illumination inside the cabinets when the doors are opened, you'll need to use a wider spot.
Okay. So someone's asking,
wider flood.
Okay. Is it strange to mix different temperature lamps in the same space?
I think it's a personal preference because I have seen many designs where that's done intentionally, or it's done and it's not really a bother to me. But for myself, it's one of those things I like to make consistent. In fact, that decorative fixture that I showed you in the presentation that I have in my own house, I actually selected to take the lamp out and find one that had a higher Kelvin rating because I have most of my fixtures at about 3,500 or 4,000 Kelvin. So yes, I think that's a personal preference. I like it to be consistent, especially in a small space. But I can see, I've seen many designs in larger spaces, especially where it's not as important. Now, I don't think it has to be house specific, because I think in your more relaxed spaces like your bedrooms and your great rooms, etc., it's very common to have a warm white light. It's when those spaces need that color differentiation, say a kitchen or a closet or a bathroom, that I think is important.
Okay. So there's been a lot of questions here about, wait, let me just look at this one. Jumping away here, sorry.
That's all right.
Someone said, if you haven't already answered, what is the recommended spacing between the LED recessed can lights in the kitchen as general lighting using flood lamps?
So I can't give you an actual answer to that because it depends on what the beam angle is for the product and how much output it's providing. So it could be that if you use a 15-degree spot, you need to place them fairly close together. If you use a 40-degree spot on the beam angle and it's actually giving you plenty of light on the counter surface, you could spread them apart a good distance. That's why it's helpful to have these beam widths provided by the manufacturers, because it tells you at what distance, how wide the light actually, the majority of the light is actually spreading. So you can kind of do your own graphic. You could take a floor plan, overlay it with a piece of trash or vellum, and draw out those circles and understand how they're going to react to each other. And again, just to reiterate, we don't need them to be tip to tip. We can do overlapping to make sure we have consistent coverage across, because that nadir is the brightest part of that light.
Okay. What are the relative benefits between a recessed can light with housing and the new LED wafer lights that are flush with the ceiling plane?
So I have yet to find a wafer light that is well engineered to provide light at a great distance. And it kind of makes sense because there is no distance for it to actually put reflectors inside of the unit. While they can be very helpful for providing general and overall lighting, and I'm not discounting that, they're really not great for task. So if you need to put them in a closet just to open the door and see, that's one thing. If you're trying to create that light on, say, a work surface where you need high intensity, you're not going to probably find it very effective using those very small flat lights.
Okay. So someone's asking, could you clarify what you meant earlier about heat being an enemy of LED?
So heat is actually an enemy for all lights, but in terms of LEDs, depending on how they're installed and how the unit that the driver, the power supply, is housed, if they're in an environment where they're constantly warm, they actually can deteriorate the light faster than it's designed to deteriorate. Now, LEDs take a long time, we know, a long time to truly deteriorate, but if you're wanting to get that full lifespan, you understand that if you place it inside the upper part of a cabinet or above the crown and you box it in, it's going to contain that heat. So we need to make sure we're not creating an issue when we install or design our lighting plans. Most of the manufacturers for recessed cans have already figured this in. There's plenty of waffles and baffles on the outside so that heat dissipates. But when you're talking about products that are in cabinet, that's when it becomes an issue.
Okay. Do you know if there is a larger island with a prominent 42-inch hood, plus there is a lot of countertop being used for cooking, prep, landing space for appliances, baking, with a 4-person eating area, what would be your recommendations? I can read that again. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. If there is a larger island with a prominent 42-inch hood, plus there's a lot of countertop being used, the countertop would be used for cooking, prep, landing space for appliances, baking, and a 4-person eating area, what would be your recommendations?
So this is one of the reasons why I think those really tiny spots are extremely effective. I'm a fan of an MR16 lamp because it provides a really direct, tight beam of light where you want it to go. And if you're doing that many things on an island, obviously the hood's going to have a light, but it may not be enough, and I'm guessing not. So I would include, especially in those areas where there's high work involved, where they're definitely using prep for cooking, I would add a can that's going to create a really tight beam into those areas to give us lots of light. And you have to be really careful about where you place it. We don't want it right on the edge of the countertop, so when we bend over or in the aisle, we block the light like the illustration showed, but we want to make sure it's far enough back that we actually get the majority of that light on the surface.
Okay, let's see. Oh, here's a good one. So how does the finish of the countertop affect the foot candle? As an example, polished granite versus honed granite, and if so, by how much does it decrease the foot candle?
That's a very good question, and it's not necessarily the foot candle because we're measuring it when it hits the surface. What you're referring to is reflectance. And yes, a glossy surface reflects more than a flat surface. And I don't have that data in front of me to give you the exact numbers, but there is a difference and that's the basic difference of luminance. When it hits that shiny surface, it's going to reflect a little bit more, and sometimes not in a positive way because you might get some glare. But when it hits a flat surface, it's not going to reflect as much. There is some formulas that tell you how much of that, but I don't have those in front of me, so sorry.
Okay. You mentioned something about a visual interior tool. Is that an app?
It's not. It's actually on the manufacturer's websites. So if I were to go to, and I'm just going to mention a few because I don't want to be too brand specific. Acuity has one, Cooper Lighting has one, Hubble Lighting has one. If you use the Halo series of lights, that's Cooper or Eaton. If you go into the product information and the photometric data, you'll see some links that will take you into that software. It's provided by the manufacturer. Now, there are software you can buy, which do the same thing in a little bit more detail, but that's usually used for lighting designers.
Okay. Let's see. So how would you account for skylights above the kitchen island in your calculations? Any thoughts on that?
Very good question. And I think a well-designed daylighting plan is important to all of our spaces. But we have to plan for no daylighting. So we have to provide really two options. And that's why dimmers are so important to any lighting design. So if we do have a really sunny day when we're working inside the kitchen during the daylight hours, we need additional lighting, but not that much. We can adjust based on how much daylighting we have in our spaces. But really, when I design a plan, I do not take the daylight into consideration.
Okay, let me see here. Your presentation was great. However, I'm still find lighting dry and complex. Is there, is there some formula you can share with us for an 8-foot ceiling and maybe the best type of lighting to use in recessed pot lights?
So I'll go back to that first slide again and talk about the PAR lights. Give me again. Watch your eyes if you're getting dizzy from me going backwards. There is a big difference between a PAR and a BR lamp. And yes, they are significantly more expensive, but there's a reason. Those PAR lamps are engineered to direct. There's all kinds of reflectors built on the inside that reflect the majority of the light out and down to a surface that we need to use it on. A BR lamp has a really, really wide angle usually. Not that you can't get a PAR that way, so make sure you pay attention to beam angles. But a BR lamp really provides a flood of light as soon as it escapes the lamp. So it is really best practices for any kind of pot light or can light, as I call them, recessed cans, to use the PAR. It is much more effective. Yes, they are more expensive, and I have found that I have to be careful. If I specify this with a installer, I make sure that they're using the lights or the lamps that I have specified, but they do make a huge difference.
Okay, so you were just talking about the PAR lights, and so someone was asking, how do they compare to like flat LEDs? Any thoughts on that?
So again, it depends on the type of LED. There are many LEDs that are manufactured in, say, a can or a retrofit kit can that have those reflectors built in to the light. But when you're talking about flat LEDs, as convenient and nice as they are, they don't have I shouldn't say any. No, they don't have very much reflective quality because there's nothing inside that helps reflect the light. It really is just the LED with the lens, and it's directed down. So be aware of that. They are not the best applications for most ceilings, I'm going on a limb and say, because of the fact that they provide really great general lighting, in kitchens specifically, but they don't provide lighting down on the surfaces where we need them. Great in places where you just need enough light to get into the space, or you just need light to see by, but not for actual tasks.
Okay. So someone's asking about when you're designing for, someone like 40 or over for aging in place, should the lighting be adjusted throughout the home or only in main areas?
Oh, good question. Unfortunately, you really should adjust the lighting levels throughout the home. And if you're aware of what happens to our eyes as we age, our eyesight degenerates after the age of 40 at a certain rate, some more than others. I'm already wearing my reading glasses all the time now because I'm on the computer so much. But we need to understand that those eyes don't change. It doesn't get better when you go into the bedroom. You don't need as much light in a bedroom. But if you're doing tasks in, say, a laundry, you still need to increase the light levels so you can see what you're doing. So as we age, we do need to see an increase in light. Again, I'll go back and refer to those dimmers because if it's too much light, sometimes in my office, I like to turn off the overhead lights and just have the computer screen because it gets a little too much, there's too much illumination for me. So I have that option, or I have the option to dim it. And if I need to clean, I brighten it up so I can see everything. So that dimming capability is really important to all designs, not just for aging in place.
Okay. What is you mentioned NADER before. Is there a definition or is this an acronym?
No, it's a definition. So that is, NADER is the 0 degrees of any light source. So we talked about beam spread, and let me just go to that one real quick. I think it's down here somewhere, so forgive me if So when you're measuring, lighting manufacturers are measuring their light sources, their light output, Typically, that measurement is taken at nadir. And they do some measurements to understand how much light fall off there is as it goes out from that 0 degrees, but they don't really do a lot of testing after 50% drop off. So we use that as an example, but we know that not every light or not every work surface is going to have that 0 degree location. There's going to be some fall off of light. So nadir is a good number to understand, and understand that we're getting that as a best case scenario, and we're going to get some loss of light as the beam angle spreads.
Okay, and I know you were talking earlier about lumens and bulbs and the Kelvin, so I don't know if you want to bring that up again, but people are asking, like, as an example, how many lumens are in the bulb when you speak of 3,500 or 4,000 Kelvin?
So that depends on the source. So they really aren't related to each other. So let me go back to, I think it was this one, right? So all manufacturers have to give lumen charts or lumen ratings. So they're all tested for lumens. Not all lights are tested for foot candles and lux. So when I go to that shelf and say the big box store down the corner, and I'm looking for a lamp to replace my broken out one in my fixture, all I really have to compare them to is that lumen level. Problem is they're all measured at the source of the light, so right at that, say, the lens, if you will, of the light. So that particular, this PAR lamp on my screen on the left and this A lamp on the right could both be 800 lumens. But as we know, just from understanding what an omnidirectional versus directional light will do, they're not going to deliver the same amount of light to the surfaces where we need them. So that's the biggest difference. It's a variation of, lumens is a measurement of output at the source, whereas lux and foot candles is measured at a given distance from that source.
Okay, that helps a little more. Let's see. So someone's asking, would you mind talking a little bit about your lighting design process in reality? Are you usually doing all the calculations that you're talking about today, or do you work with someone to do that?
Well, so I usually do the calculations now because I teach them to my students. So, okay. I have to kind of walk the talk. But I am not opposed to using, and as a matter of fact, I have my students use those tools provided from the main manufacturer's websites to give a visual 3D realization of spaces. So they first learn how to use the formula or understand the parts of the formula. We do some working of those calculations together, and then we use those tools to compare and understand how they give you the same information and how they could be a benefit and help save some time. So in reality, I think it's a combination of the above, but it's important to understand those parts of the calculation in order to understand the photometric data, to be honest.
And that brings me to the question a lot of people have been asking, are there some handout or slides that you can share when I send out the recording tomorrow? Or
I can share these slides. It's not a problem.
Okay, great.
I'll save them as a PDF and send them to you, Debbie, so you can send them out.
Good to know. And then there's a lot more questions here. Are you able to keep going for?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm glad I ended early.
All right.
That was not the plan.
That's good. It's all good. So let's see. What are the advantages and we're going back to LED lighting. What are the advantages and disadvantages of low voltage as opposed to the voltage on LED lighting?
So low voltage lighting, LED lighting is typically low voltage by definition. Because they use like 12 or 24 volts as a comparison to like 120 we see in a typical household circuitry system. So there is some kind of step down requirement needed so they don't blow, if you will, in simple terms. So there really isn't a normal voltage level with LEDs. There is something that steps them down. When you deal with voltage lighting, you're typically dealing with like halogens or incandescent lighting or xenon lighting and those sorts. They still exist in the marketplace, but they're much less common than you might see nowadays. For example, that typical A lamp, the one on the left here in this diagram, is what we think of as that light bulb moment, and it's an incandescent, right? it's probably the least efficient light source out there, but it's still very common and we can still get them.
Yeah, more questions about LED. So what is your opinion of the high-end integrated LED recessed, especially the smaller apertures of 2 inches, life, beam spreads, and Kelvin?
So, and again, close your eyes if you get dizzy. So I'm going to actually have some examples of the really tiny ones in here. This is a 4-inch somewhere here. Did I pass it? I did pass it. Sorry. This one. There we go. So this is actually a 2-inch opening, but a 4-inch nominal recess fixture. I think if you're needing that really tight beam angle, this is a very valid product for that. So I don't think there's anything wrong. Sorry, I'm looking at some of the notes. I don't think there's anything wrong with using those smaller apertures. It really is a personal choice. I do know that we are using a lot of the bigger ones because we're typically doing retrofits. So we don't want to re-sheetrock the whole ceiling and have to do a lot of work. So we'll use a retrofit kit and keep the 5 or 6-inch can and just use a different trim for it. But I'm a fan of the smaller ones myself.
Okay, let's see. We were talking earlier about aging in place. Is using bluer light better for clarity?
That's a very good point because as we age, our lens turns yellow. So we do see things in more of a yellow light. We have to be careful though because our bodies understand that blue light, it affects our circadian rhythm. And there's lots of amazing studies. If you have a chance to hear Doug Walter talk about that in his wellness and lighting lecture, it's a great study. He gives you all the examples of what they've looked at this in nursing homes and done studies on changing the color temperature only of the light inside the patient rooms and in the hallways and how that affects their overall well-being, their health is affected by this. So there is some real advantages to understanding the differences. We can be careful though with just placing blue lights because we don't want them on all the time. And that's where those tunable lights are very helpful because you can use those and even have them set on a program to be at a certain temperature for certain parts of the day and then go warmer for later parts of the day so that our body is not affected and we keep our normal circadian rhythms.
That's a good point. Thank you. Let's see. Someone's asking, I have seen a term delivered lumens on some fixture specs. Are you familiar with this term?
Delivered lumens. What that's referring to, and this is common with LED products nowadays, and we used to just use formulas to create these photometric data sheets. So we would get some testing and do the formulas and create this chart. Now we actually, especially with LEDs, we do all the testing in the lab. So the actual delivered lumens are measured in the lab. Again, that's best case scenario, not considering any of the environmental impact. So we have to understand there's going to be less than that more than likely, almost always, when we come to the results of that light.
Okay, here's one. I often work in high-rise buildings with cement ceilings in the units. Often there's only one electric box in the ceiling of each room.
Oh.
What sorts of light fixtures would you suggest I use? Again, sounds like a commercial space. I would use in a kitchen to provide a good amount of light. So,
you poor thing, and it could be a high-rise residential application too. So, I would probably spend some time in figuring out if I could create some artificial beams or some small drop-down areas in that ceiling to carry the power and the lights throughout the space. Because it's really nice to have that additional lighting, especially for islands, which just seem like the thing nowadays for having enough light to hit the surfaces. I don't discount under cabinet lighting those because they've become so much more powerful. So first case scenario or the worst case scenario is you look at some really powerful under cabinet lighting, especially in those areas where there's really high task, and get as much of that light onto the countertop as you can.
Okay, I've got time here for 2 more questions. So are there major differences between dimmer manufacturers? And if there is, what should we look for when specifying?
The great thing about the major manufacturers for dimmers are really kind of, the best. They've done a lot of research and testing. the Lutrons, the Legrands, all those guys really know their stuff. And if you want to talk to your lighting manufacturer, they will often recommend one product they use or they test with on a regular basis. So that's the best way, in my opinion, to go. If you're unsure, make sure you talk to both of those manufacturers to make sure the products are compatible. LEDs do have some issues in making sure we're using the right kind of dimmer for an LED product.
Okay. And then people would like to have your contact information, so I'm sure that I can provide that to them.
Yeah, I can put it on the bottom of the last slide.
Oh, perfect. And then let's see. This we're over time, but I just wanted to address this last one, which I think is really interesting. We've been in a period where Edison bulbs and clear pendants have been very popular. We know they are almost purely decorative and don't offer much task lighting. How do you account for this in a lighting plan if a client insists on this lifestyle, especially in a kitchen?
So, I tell my students, if I see one more fixture in your design that's a bare bulb on a wooden beam, I think I may scream. So I completely understand. It's popular with the younger set as well. And the biggest problem with those, and something that they don't quite understand yet, is the glare that they produce. It makes it very uncomfortable, especially for someone who's older in that space to function. So first of all, I try to convince them not to. And then I try to change their mind, which I'm sure you do the same. But if not, I also understand that putting those items on dimmers will really help us be able to control that glare and that issue that we have with some of those fixtures, and also adding additional lighting on top of that, almost as kind of a replacement, understanding that that's the decorative component, but this is the task light, so the can that I'm putting over it or next to it to give more lighting is really the best solution.
That's great, Karen. This has been really great, and we're over time at this point, and I want to thank all of you. I apologize if we haven't gotten to all the questions. I did copy the chat, and I'll give that to Karen. But I want to thank you so much, Karen. This has been great, really illuminating, as they say, and this is very, very complex information, so really appreciate that you shared this with us today.
It is, and I'll be happy to take any questions. If I did not answer your question, feel free to email me. I'll give, of course, Debbie has all my contact information. I'm happy to answer questions. We're between semesters, so I have time right now. It's a good time.
That sounds great, Karen. Thanks again, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. Have a wonderful day.